Just after sunrise on an October morning in 2003, more than 200 farmers stood in complete silence around 200 acres they had spent years calling dead, and not one of them could explain how the widow they had once laughed at had seen something every one of them had missed. Some knelt to scoop the dark soil into their hands, while others walked slowly through the fields without saying a word, because 5 years earlier most of those same men had refused to set foot on the property, insisting it was the most worthless ground in Pine Ridge County, and quietly wondering why any grieving widow would throw away the last of her husband's inheritance trying to save land that even weeds struggled to survive on. One elderly farmer stood near the old wooden gate for several moments before slowly removing his cap, his eyes never leaving the fields, as he admitted that he had been among the loudest voices telling her to sell the farm, walk away, and never look back, because he truly believed she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Yet after another long silence he gently shook his head and said, "We all thought she was refusing to let go of dead ground, but the truth was, she was the only one who never gave up on something still worth saving." 5 years earlier, 3 days after burying her husband, the widow sat alone inside a small lawyer's office, listening as the final page of his will was quietly folded shut. And when the attorney looked up and gently explained that the only thing her husband had been able to leave behind was 200 acres, everyone in Pine Ridge County believed were completely worthless. Nobody inside the room imagined that the next decision she made would one day bring hundreds of farmers back to that same forgotten land. Long before anyone in Pine Ridge County laughed at the widow for refusing to sell 200 acres of dead ground, before farmers traveled for hours just to walk across the fields they once dismissed, and years before people began telling her story as though they had believed in her from the beginning, there was a small white farmhouse where happiness had never depended on how much money a family owned, because the two people living there had quietly built a life around the ordinary moments most of the world never notices until they're gone. Every morning began almost exactly the same, because Thomas Harper always woke before sunrise, quietly slipping out of bed without making enough noise to disturb his wife, before walking onto the front porch to start the coffee, and by the time she stepped into the kitchen a few minutes later, he would already be standing there with 2 steaming mugs waiting on the table, smiling the same smile that had greeted her nearly every morning since the day they were married, as though he still couldn't quite believe she had chosen to spend her life beside him. Neighbors often joked that the Harpers were still behaving like newlyweds, despite being married for more than 15 years, because Thomas never drove past the farmhouse without giving the truck horn 2 short taps if he knew she was outside, while she never packed his lunch without slipping a handwritten note into the old metal lunch box he carried every day. Not because either of them believed those little habits changed the world, but because they quietly understood something many people spend a lifetime forgetting: that love is usually built from ordinary days, repeated with extraordinary faithfulness. Their evenings belonged to the farm, because after supper they almost always walked the property together, sometimes talking about the future, sometimes saying almost nothing at all while watching the sunset settle across fields most people considered too poor to ever become truly valuable. Yet Thomas never spoke about those acres the way everyone else did, because whenever neighbors called the ground dead, he would simply smile, kneel long enough to let the dry earth run through his fingers, and softly say, "Land has a way of surprising people who don't give up on it too soon." Words that always made her laugh, because she liked teasing him that he was the only man in the county capable of carrying on a conversation with dirt, while he laughed just as easily before replying, "Maybe that's because most people never stop long enough to listen." She would roll her eyes, gently slip her hand into his as they continued walking toward home, and although neither of them could have known it then, Those ordinary evenings would one day become the memories she would cling to with every ounce of strength she had left. Thomas Harper often joked that the only thing more stubborn than the dry ground surrounding their farmhouse was his wife, because whenever life became difficult, she somehow found a reason to laugh before he did, a habit he claimed had rescued him more times than she would ever know, while she always answered by reminding him that someone had to keep hope alive whenever he spent too much time worrying about crops, bills, or the endless repairs that seemed to follow every season on a struggling farm. Neither of them cared much about what the county thought, because they had learned long ago that peaceful evenings on the porch were worth more than impressing people who never stayed long enough to know you. And although money was often tight, there was always enough laughter inside the Harper home to make the place feel richer than houses twice its size. Some evenings Thomas played old country songs on the battered radio while repairing tools. She shelled peas beside him, and before either of them realized it, darkness had settled over the fields without either feeling the need to say very much, because silence had never been uncomfortable between people who understood each other so well. The only subject that ever made their conversations linger long after sunset was the 200 acres stretching beyond the old oak trees, because nearly everyone in Pine Ridge County believed the land had been ruined decades earlier by poor farming, drought, and years of neglect. Yet Thomas stubbornly refused to accept that something created by God could become completely worthless, simply because people had stopped believing in it, often smiling as he looked across the cracked ground before quietly saying, "One day people will see this place differently," causing her to laugh softly, nudge his shoulder, and remind him that he had been saying exactly the same thing since the day they married, while Thomas only grinned before replying, "That's because the land hasn't finished telling its story yet." She never pretended to understand the land the way he did, but she understood him, and that was enough, because love had taught her that believing in a person sometimes mattered more than understanding every dream they carried. So whenever Thomas spoke about restoring the forgotten acres instead of selling them, she simply squeezed his hand and smiled in the quiet confidence that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Late one autumn afternoon, they walked the property one more time before heading home for supper, stopping where the cracked earth met a small patch of stubborn wildflowers somehow growing through the dry soil, and Thomas quietly knelt to admire them before gently saying, "People always notice what's dead first. They almost never notice what's still alive." Words she tucked away, without realizing they would one day become the sentence she repeated to herself whenever the world insisted she had nothing left to fight for. As they turned toward the farmhouse with the evening sun settling behind them, neither of them noticed the pickup truck slowly approaching along the dusty county road, carrying news that would divide their lives forever into two parts: everything before that evening and everything after it. The pickup truck rolled slowly into the Harper driveway, just as the last light of evening disappeared beyond the fields, and although Thomas smiled when he recognized Dr. Collins climbing out instead of waiting for him to come to the porch, he quietly joked that doctors usually didn't make house calls unless they were delivering either very good news or very bad news, a remark that earned only a tired smile before the older man gently explained that several neighboring counties had been placed under severe storm warnings and asked every farmer living near the river to move equipment and livestock to higher ground before nightfall, because no one knew exactly how much rain was coming. Thomas thanked him, promised he would take care of everything before dark, and after the truck disappeared back down the road, He turned toward his wife with the familiar confidence she had always admired, gently squeezing her hand before telling her not to worry because they had seen storms before and this one would pass just like all the others, leaving the two of them to spend the next several hours moving tools, checking fences, and making sure every animal had been brought safely inside, before finally returning to the farmhouse long after darkness had settled across the county. Rain began sometime after midnight. At first it tapped softly against the bedroom window, almost gently enough to be mistaken for an ordinary autumn shower, but before dawn the wind had strengthened. Thunder rolled across the valley, and Thomas was already pulling on his boots, while quietly telling his wife he wanted to check the far pasture before daylight because one section of fence had worried him the evening before, causing her to sit up and ask if it couldn't wait until morning. Yet he only leaned over, kissed her forehead, smiled the same reassuring smile he had worn 1,000 times before, and softly promised, "I'll be back before the coffee's ready." She watched him disappear into the rain, never imagining those would be the last words she would ever hear him speak. And when the coffee finished brewing exactly as he had promised it would, she poured 2 cups out of habit, one for herself and one for Thomas, before standing quietly in the kitchen as steam drifted from both mugs, and the old clock ticked through another 15 minutes, then another 30, until concern slowly replaced patience, sending her onto the porch to search the rain-soaked fields for the familiar outline of his truck. Yet beyond the curtain of falling rain there was nothing except the empty road stretching toward the pasture, and by late morning neighbors had already begun searching. By afternoon the sheriff had arrived, and just before sunset they found Thomas. He had managed to free 2 frightened calves trapped against a collapsed section of fence before the swollen creek swept him from his footing. And although every person who helped bring him home spoke about the courage it had taken to save those animals, none of those words reached the woman sitting silently on the porch, because the only sentence still echoing inside her mind was the one he had spoken before walking into the rain. "I'll be back before the coffee's ready." 3 days later, after the funeral ended and the last neighbor quietly drove away, she walked back into the farmhouse carrying the casserole dishes people had lovingly brought over, placed them one by one on the kitchen counter, and, without thinking, reached into the cupboard for 2 coffee mugs before suddenly stopping, one hand resting against the cabinet door, as the silence inside the house gently reminded her that there would never again be anyone waiting for the second cup, leaving her to slowly return the mug to its place before lowering herself into a chair where, for the first time since the cemetery, she quietly covered her face with both hands and allowed herself to cry. The days following Thomas Harper's funeral passed with the strange quietness that often settles over a home after relatives, neighbors, and close friends have all returned to their own lives, because although casseroles still filled the refrigerator, sympathy cards remained stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, and people continued stopping by to ask whether she needed anything. Every act of kindness seemed to leave the house feeling just a little emptier once the front door closed again, reminding her that no amount of company could replace the one person whose footsteps she still caught herself listening for every morning. She tried keeping the same routines they had always shared, because routine somehow felt safer than change. Waking before sunrise to start the coffee, opening the curtains overlooking the fields, and feeding the chickens exactly as she had done countless times before, yet every ordinary task now carried the weight of an absence she couldn't escape, and although she caught herself reaching for 2 coffee mugs more than once, she always stopped just before taking the second one down, quietly resting her hand against the cupboard door for a few moments before closing it again, because some habits disappear all at once, while others leave your heart one morning at a time. The farm itself seemed strangely unchanged, with the old oak tree still casting its shadow across the yard, the windmill still turning whenever the breeze picked up, and the cracked fields stretching toward the horizon exactly as they always had, almost as though the land hadn't yet realized the one man who believed in it more than anyone else would never walk across it again. And many evenings she found herself standing on the porch, long after sunset, watching the fading light settle over the 200 acres, while remembering the countless times Thomas had smiled toward that same horizon and quietly insisted the land wasn't dead, only misunderstood, words she had never fully understood then, but found herself repeating silently now, simply because hearing them in her own mind somehow made him feel a little closer. A week later, she returned to the lawyer's office to settle the final paperwork, and after gently sliding a neatly folded document across the desk, the attorney apologized that there was so little to give because years of poor harvests, medical bills, and unpaid loans had consumed almost everything Thomas had owned, leaving behind only the farmhouse, a few aging pieces of equipment, and the 200 acres everyone in Pine Ridge County had spent years describing as worthless, before carefully explaining that several buyers had already expressed interest in purchasing the property if she decided she didn't want the responsibility of maintaining it alone. She thanked him politely, folded the papers without reading them again, and quietly walked outside, where the autumn wind carried dried leaves across the courthouse steps, only to find 3 familiar neighbors waiting beside their trucks because news always seemed to travel faster than people in small farming communities admitted, and after offering their condolences once more, one of the older men gently told her that nobody would blame her for selling the land. Another assured her it was probably the wisest decision she could make, while a third kindly reminded her she was still young enough to begin again somewhere else, advice offered with genuine concern rather than cruelty. Yet every word somehow made the decision feel heavier, because they were asking her to let go of the last dream Thomas had carried with him until the day he died. She looked toward the folded papers resting quietly in her hands, thought about the evenings they had spent walking those forgotten fields together, remembered the way Thomas always smiled whenever someone called the land dead. And although she wasn't ready to answer anyone that afternoon, she climbed into her truck, carrying something far heavier than legal documents, because for the first time since losing her husband, she realized the hardest part of grief wasn't saying goodbye. It was deciding what to do with the life the two of you had planned together. For almost 2 weeks, the folded inheritance papers remained untouched on the corner of the kitchen table because every time she reached for them, another memory quietly found its way between her hand and the documents, sometimes reminding her of Thomas laughing as he tried to teach her the difference between healthy soil and exhausted ground, sometimes bringing back the evenings they spent walking the 200 acres while he spoke about possibilities nobody else seemed able to see, leaving her to quietly push the papers aside once more because signing them somehow felt less like making a financial decision and more like deciding how much of their shared future she was willing to let disappear. The advice never stopped coming because neighbors continued visiting with the best intentions, some bringing homemade pies, others offering to help sell the equipment before prices dropped any further, while nearly every conversation eventually found its way back to the same gentle suggestion that she should sell the land, pay off the remaining debts, and begin again somewhere far away from a place carrying so many painful memories. And although every word came from genuine kindness, she couldn't escape the feeling that everyone was asking her to bury one more piece of Thomas after she had already said goodbye. One crisp autumn afternoon, she finally gathered enough courage to walk the property alone, following the same narrow path she and Thomas had wandered so many evenings before, until she reached the small patch of stubborn wildflowers growing through the cracked earth. And as she quietly stood there looking across the silent fields, she found herself smiling through tears while remembering the way he had knelt beside those flowers, gently brushing the dust from their tiny petals before saying, "People always notice what's dead first. They almost never notice what's still alive." Words that had seemed like nothing more than another one of Thomas's hopeful observations at the time, but now settled inside her heart with a meaning she hadn't recognized before. She slowly slipped her wedding ring from her finger for the first time since the funeral, turning it gently between her thumb and forefinger while looking across the land they had once dreamed about together, and for one frightening moment she honestly considered placing it inside her pocket before driving back to town to sign the sale papers, because she wasn't sure she had enough strength to carry both the grief and the farm. Yet after several long moments she quietly slid the ring back onto her finger, took one last look across the 200 acres, and whispered, "I'm not ready to leave you yet." Words spoken so softly that only the autumn wind carried them away, though deep inside she wasn't entirely certain whether she had been speaking to the land or to Thomas. The following morning she returned to the lawyer's office carrying the same inheritance papers everyone expected her to sign, and after patiently waiting while he reviewed the final documents, the attorney gently placed a pen on the desk before asking if she was ready to complete the sale, causing her to lower her eyes toward the signature line for several quiet moments before slowly sliding the papers back across the desk, untouched, and softly answering, "No, I'm going to keep it." A decision that left the room completely silent, because although nobody spoke for several seconds, everyone understood she had just chosen the hardest road available to her. Outside the office, one of the neighboring farmers who had sincerely hoped she would sell caught up with her before she reached her truck, gently shaking his head as he admitted he was only trying to spare her years of heartbreak. Yet she simply thanked him for caring before climbing behind the wheel, and as she drove home along the familiar country road, she glanced toward the distant fields waiting beyond the old oak trees, not because she suddenly knew how she was going to save them, but because for the first time since Thomas walked into the rain, she had finally made a decision that belonged to her instead of her grief. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and although the fields surrounding the Harper farmhouse looked no different from the day Thomas had last walked them, something inside the widow had quietly changed, because every morning she now stepped onto the porch carrying a notebook instead of uncertainty, spending long hours walking the 200 acres exactly as her husband once had, stopping often to study the cracked ground beneath her boots, even when she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for, simply believing that if Thomas had seen hope there for so many years, then perhaps she owed it to him and to herself to keep looking a little longer. The county noticed almost immediately, because in small farming communities it never takes long for people to realize when someone begins doing the unexpected, and before long pickup trucks slowed beside the old fence almost every afternoon as neighbors watched the widow clearing brush, repairing broken gates, and marking sections of land everyone else had abandoned years earlier, leaving many to quietly shake their heads while others stopped to offer one final piece of well-meaning advice, gently reminding her that hard work could never change dead ground, and that no one would think less of her if she finally decided to sell before the farm consumed everything Thomas had spent his life trying to protect. She thanked every one of them with the same quiet kindness, never arguing, never defending herself, and never pretending she had all the answers, because the truth was, she often returned to the farmhouse each evening carrying more questions than confidence. Yet every sunrise somehow found her back in the fields once again, choosing effort over certainty simply because standing still had begun to hurt more than moving forward. The only person who never told her to sell was 81-year-old Benjamin Walker, whose small farm bordered the northern edge of her property and whose weathered pickup appeared every few days carrying nothing more than a thermos of coffee and an old folding chair, because instead of offering advice, he usually sat beside the fence watching her work until she wandered over for a short break. And although some afternoons they hardly exchanged more than a few sentences, his quiet company somehow made the farm feel a little less lonely than it had the day before. One afternoon, after watching her struggle for nearly an hour to pull an old cedar stump from the edge of a neglected field, Benjamin slowly climbed out of his truck, picked up the other end of the chain without saying a single word, and together they worked until the stubborn roots finally gave way, leaving the old farmer smiling as he wiped the dirt from his hands before softly saying, "Some things were never meant to be carried alone." Words that brought an unexpected smile to her face because they reminded her how easy it is to mistake quiet presence for small kindness, when, in truth, it is often one of the greatest gifts another person can offer. That evening, after Benjamin had driven home and the sun settled behind the old oak trees, she stood alone near the highest point of the property, looking across the silent 200 acres before quietly whispering, "I still don't know if I can do this, Thomas." And although the fields offered no answer, she realized something had changed without her noticing, because for the first time since the funeral, she hadn't spent the entire day thinking about what she had lost. She had spent it working toward what might still be possible. Spring arrived with all the promise Thomas had always loved. Yet the season refused to unfold the way she had quietly hoped, because weeks of hard work produced little more than small victories, scattered across a landscape that still looked lifeless to everyone driving past, leaving the widow to spend long days repairing fences, clearing neglected ground, and planting where she believed the land still had a chance, only to watch poor soil, unexpected dry spells, and mounting expenses slowly consume the little money she had left, until every evening ended with another page of numbers that simply refused to add up. She never spoke about the growing worry whenever Benjamin stopped by, because she had already learned that pretending to be strong was sometimes easier than admitting she was afraid. Yet the old farmer noticed the changes anyway, seeing meals left untouched on the kitchen table, lamps burning long after midnight, and fresh lines of exhaustion quietly appearing across a face that had once laughed so easily. Though he never questioned her, because some burdens become lighter through company rather than conversation, choosing instead to leave a basket of fresh vegetables on the porch now and then before driving away without waiting for thanks. By early summer, the letters began arriving. One reminded her that another payment was overdue. Another warned that interest continued growing. A third politely explained that unless something changed soon, the farm itself might eventually become part of the debt. She folded each letter carefully, placed them inside the same kitchen drawer, and quietly returned to work, because worrying about tomorrow never seemed to make today's work any lighter. Then came the afternoon that finally broke what little certainty she still had. A violent windstorm swept across Pine Ridge County without warning, tearing through the fields just as the first healthy crop had finally begun showing signs of life, and by the time the sky cleared, broken branches lay scattered across the farm, young plants had been flattened into the mud, and weeks of fragile progress had disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the damaged field, while the silence around her somehow felt louder than the storm itself. She didn't cry. She simply looked across the ruined ground for a long time before slowly walking back to the farmhouse, where the unopened sale documents still rested inside the kitchen drawer. And after taking them out for the first time in months, She spread them across the table, found the place where her signature belonged, and quietly laid a pen beside the papers before whispering, "I'm sorry, Thomas. I really tried." Words spoken with the heartbreaking honesty of someone who believed she had reached the end of her strength rather than the end of her courage. That evening, Benjamin's pickup rolled slowly into the driveway as it always had, but when he stepped onto the porch and noticed the unsigned sale papers lying on the kitchen table through the open window, he didn't ask a single question because he already understood, choosing instead to leave the thermos of coffee beside the front door before turning back toward his truck, only stopping long enough to softly say, "Whatever you decide tomorrow, don't make the decision tonight." And with that, he quietly drove away, leaving her standing alone on the porch, watching the fading tail lights disappear into the evening, the pen still resting on the table behind her as the wind gently stirred the unsigned papers waiting inside. She barely slept that night because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the unsigned sale papers waiting on the kitchen table, and although exhaustion urged her to end the struggle, while common sense whispered that everyone else had been right from the beginning, Benjamin's quiet words somehow refused to leave her mind, reminding her that tomorrow would still be there after sunrise. So instead of reaching for the pen, she quietly made a pot of coffee, slipped on her boots, and walked toward the fields one more time, telling herself it wasn't to change her decision, but simply to say goodbye to the place Thomas had loved so deeply. The morning air carried the fresh scent that often follows a night of rain, and as she wandered slowly across the damaged fields without any real destination, she noticed something that made her stop, because beneath the flattened plants and scattered branches, the ground looked different than it had only a few days before, prompting her to kneel and gently brush aside the loose layer of earth until rich, dark soil slipped quietly through her fingers, far softer and deeper than the pale, exhausted ground she remembered working only weeks earlier, leaving her to sit there in complete silence as memories of Thomas, studying the land, returned one by one, not as comforting words from the past, but as observations. She suddenly realized he had been trying to teach her all along. She hurried back to the farmhouse, climbed into the attic where Thomas had stored old boxes no one had opened since his funeral, and after searching for several minutes, found a weathered notebook tied together with faded baling twine, its pages filled with years of handwritten observations about rainfall, changing soil, forgotten drainage paths, and the strange way certain parts of the property always seemed healthier after seasons everyone else considered disasters, causing her to slowly turn each page until one sentence made her hands tremble. "The land isn't dead. It's simply waiting for someone patient enough to understand what it's becoming." She carried the notebook back into the field and spent the rest of the afternoon comparing Thomas's notes with the ground beneath her boots, discovering that the places everyone had avoided for years were the very places he had marked with the most careful observations, and as each small detail quietly confirmed the one before it, something began changing inside her, because for the first time since standing beside his grave, she no longer felt as though she was trying to finish Thomas's dream alone. She felt as though he had been gently leading her toward this moment all along. That evening, Benjamin stopped by, as he always did, quietly noticing the sale papers were no longer lying on the kitchen table, before looking toward the open notebook resting beside two untouched cups of coffee, and after reading only a single page, he smiled to himself, closed the cover without another word, and softly asked, "So, what did he leave you?" causing her to glance toward the fields through the kitchen window before answering with the first genuine smile Benjamin had seen since the funeral. "Not 200 acres," she said gently. "He left me away to see them." Benjamin chuckled quietly, tipped his hat, and started toward the porch before stopping just long enough to look back and say, "Then I'd say you're finally inheriting the right thing." Words that lingered in the silent farmhouse long after his truck disappeared down the dusty road, while inside, the unsigned sale papers remained folded beneath Thomas's notebook, no longer waiting for a signature because they had quietly become nothing more than another part of the past. 5 years passed more quietly than anyone in Pine Ridge County expected, because the transformation of the Harper farm never happened all at once, arriving instead through hundreds of ordinary mornings filled with careful observation, patient decisions, and lessons Thomas had written down long before anyone believed they would matter, leaving the widow to rebuild the 200 acres one season at a time until the cracked, forgotten fields people once called dead slowly became some of the healthiest farmland anywhere along the county line, though she rarely spoke about success because she had learned that the land always preferred quiet work over loud celebration. The first visitors arrived almost by accident when a neighboring farmer stopped beside the fence one spring morning after noticing that her crops remained healthy despite weeks of dry weather. And after spending nearly an hour walking the fields together, he drove home carrying far more questions than answers, only to return a few weeks later with two friends who wanted to see the farm for themselves, while before long those quiet visits gradually turned into a steady stream of pickup trucks arriving from neighboring counties as word spread that the widow who had refused to sell 200 acres everyone considered worthless had discovered something experienced farmers could no longer ignore. She welcomed every visitor exactly the same way Thomas had always welcomed neighbors, meeting them at the old wooden gate with a warm smile, a fresh pot of coffee waiting on the porch, and all the time they needed, because she never believed knowledge became less valuable by being shared, often walking slowly across the fields with groups of complete strangers while showing them Thomas's weathered notebook, pointing toward the parts of the land most people had overlooked, and quietly explaining that the farm hadn't changed overnight because the greatest transformation had happened long before the crops ever improved, beginning the day she stopped asking whether the land was hopeless and started asking what it was trying to teach her. One cool October morning, more than 200 farmers stood quietly across the same property where laughter had once echoed so freely, some kneeling to study the rich black soil, while others carefully copied notes into small notebooks of their own, and among them stood several familiar faces from Pine Ridge County, including the elderly farmer who had once urged her to sell because he believed he was protecting her from heartbreak, causing him to slowly remove his cap before walking over and softly saying, "I came here today to learn, and I suppose I also came to tell you I was wrong." Words spoken without embarrassment, because genuine humility has a way of sounding much softer than pride ever does. She smiled with the same quiet grace that had carried her through every difficult season, gently shook his hand, and simply answered, "You cared enough to worry about me. There's nothing to forgive." A reply that left the old farmer standing silently for several moments, because he realized the most remarkable thing growing on those 200 acres wasn't the harvest surrounding them. It was the heart of the woman who had refused to let bitterness take root. As the afternoon drew to a close and the last visitors slowly made their way back toward the long line of pickup trucks waiting along the county road, Benjamin remained seated beneath the old oak tree overlooking the fields, watching the widow patiently answer one final question before she began walking home, and when she reached him, he smiled, looked across the farm that had once seemed impossible to save, and quietly said, "Looks like they finally see what Thomas saw," causing her to glance toward the fields before gently shaking her head with a peaceful smile and replying, "No, they finally see what he taught me to see." words that somehow meant even more because they reminded both of them that the greatest inheritance Thomas had ever left behind was never the land itself. It was the eyes to understand it. 5 years after the day almost everyone urged her to sell the farm, life on the Harper property had settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around proving anyone wrong, because although visitors still arrived from distant counties hoping to understand the land, the widow quietly returned to the same ordinary routines that had always mattered most: greeting the sunrise from the front porch with a cup of coffee, walking the fields before anyone else arrived, and ending each evening beneath the old oak tree where she and Thomas had once sat together, dreaming about a future neither of them would ever fully share, discovering that peace rarely comes when life becomes what you expected, but often arrives when you finally accept the life you've been given. Benjamin continued stopping by from time to time, though far less often than before, because he understood she no longer needed someone to help carry the weight she had once struggled beneath. And during one of those visits, he quietly admitted that watching her rebuild both the farm and her life had reminded him of something his own father used to say, that the strongest people are rarely the ones who never break, but the ones who somehow keep choosing kindness after life gives them every reason not to. Words that made her smile because she knew Thomas would have liked them, and after they finished their coffee, Benjamin slowly climbed back into his pickup, tipped his hat one final time, and drove away, leaving her standing on the porch with the comforting realization that some people enter your life only long enough to help you find your own strength before quietly stepping aside. One cool autumn evening, she wandered across the fields as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold, eventually stopping beside the small patch of wild flowers where Thomas had once knelt all those years before, and after lowering herself to the ground, she gently brushed away a little dust from the tiny blossoms exactly as he used to do, smiling through grateful tears as she whispered, "You were right. People really do notice what's dead before they notice what's still alive," before lifting her eyes across the 200 acres stretching peacefully toward the horizon and quietly adding, "Thank you for teaching me to see." The wind moved gently across the fields just as it had countless evenings before, carrying with it the familiar rustle of healthy crops that now covered ground once dismissed as hopeless. And although no voice answered her, she no longer felt the aching silence that had filled the farmhouse after Thomas's funeral, because somewhere along the journey she had discovered that love doesn't disappear when the person you love is gone. It simply begins speaking through different things, through old notebooks, ordinary memories, quiet mornings, faithful friends, and even forgotten fields that patiently wait for someone willing to believe they still have life left inside them. Looking back, people often tell the story as though it were about a widow who transformed 200 acres of dead ground into one of the finest farms in Arkansas. But those who truly knew her understand that the land was never the greatest miracle because long before the fields came back to life, a broken heart quietly found the courage to keep beating. And perhaps that's why farmers still drive for hours to stand along that old fence, not simply to study the soil beneath their feet, but to remember that sometimes the world gives up on people and places far too soon, while hope has always belonged to those willing to stay a little longer. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly carried love, grief, or hope with more courage than anyone ever noticed, we'd love to hear about them in the comments because stories like theirs deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to join us for more true-to-life rural stories that celebrate resilience, kindness, and the quiet strength found in ordinary people, consider subscribing to The Last Acre, where every acre holds a story, every season leaves a lesson, and sometimes the things the world calls dead are only waiting for someone willing to see them differently. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. We'll see you in the next story.